Captain Aidan Hale stood at the edge of the landing platform and watched the alien city stretch out before him, like a dream made of gold and glass. The towers of the Valhari throne world rose so high they seemed to pierce the clouds themselves, and every surface caught the light of their twin suns and scattered it into colors that had no name in any human language. He had been a soldier for 12 years, and he had seen many worlds, but nothing like this. A voice crackled in his earpiece and told him to report to the Royal Guard Command Center on level 47. And he picked up his duffel bag and walked inside. The hallways were wide enough for 10 men to walk side by side, and the ceilings were carved with ancient symbols that glowed faintly blue in the dim light. Valhari officers passed him without a second glance, and some of them were nearly 8 feet tall, with smooth, iridescent skin that shifted between violet and silver. Angle. Their eyes were large and dark and ancient, and when they did look at him, it was the way a person might look at an insect on the windowsill. Aidan was used to it by now. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and in a galaxy full of species that lived for centuries, humans were considered little more than clever animals with short lives and loud opinions. The Valhari called them mayflies. It was not meant as a compliment. He reached the command center and presented his orders to a tall Valhari officer named Lord Vethis, who read the document on his screen and then looked at Aidan the way one might examine something unpleasant stuck to the bottom of a shoe. "You are the human security attachment," Vethis said, and his voice was smooth and cold, like water running over stone. "Yes, sir," Aidan replied. "You will be assigned to the protective detail of Princess Tyeli, youngest daughter of Queen Savara." Continued. "This is a political courtesy and nothing more. You are not expected to actually do anything. Try not to get in the way." Aidan simply nodded and said, "Understood, sir." Vethis waved him off, and a junior guard led him through a maze of corridors to the royal residential wing, where he was given a small room that was clearly meant for servants. He did not complain. He unpacked his gear and laid it out on the narrow bed and checked every piece the way he always did. His sidearm and his backup weapon and his combat knife and his body armor, which was made of simple ballistic plates rather than the bioenergy shields the Valhari used. It was heavy and ugly and outdated by galactic standards, but it worked without a power source, and that was something Aidan had learned to value. He met Princess Tyeli the next morning in the garden courtyard, where she was reading something on a floating display screen. She was smaller than most Valhari, feet tall, and younger than the others, with skin that shimmered a soft lavender in the morning light. Her eyes were the color of deep amber, and when she looked up at Aidan, there was no warmth in them at all. "So you are my new mayfly guard," she said, and her voice carried the same cool superiority that every Valhari seemed to be born with. "Captain Aidan Hale, Your Highness," he said with a short bow. "How old are you, Captain?" 34. She tilted her head, and something like pity crossed her face, and she said, "I am 212. When you are dust I will still be young. Tell me, why should I trust my safety to someone who will be dead before I finish my next century?" Aidan looked at her calmly and said, "Because I will make every one of my short years count, Your Highness." She turned back to her screen without another word, and Aidan took his position by the garden entrance, and began to do what he did best. He watched. Over the next 3 weeks, Aidan learned the rhythms of the palace, the way a hunter learns the forest. He mapped every corridor, and every exit, and every blind spot in the security grid, and he found 17 vulnerabilities that the Royal Guard had overlooked because they had grown comfortable behind their technology. He filed reports with Lord Vethis, and every single one was ignored. So Aidan began to quietly fix what he could on his own. He adjusted camera angles and repositioned sensor nodes and memorized the patrol schedules so he could fill the gaps himself. He did all of this without being asked and without telling anyone. Tyeli barely spoke to him during this time, But he noticed things about her too. She was lonely in a way that even the luxury of a palace could not hide. Her older sisters were groomed for power and war, but Tyeli was the spare, the political piece to be traded in marriage or treaty when the time was right. She read constantly, and she wandered the palace at odd hours, and she had a habit of slipping away from her guards when she was bored, which was often. Aiden never stopped her, but he always followed at a distance, close enough to help and far enough to let her feel free. Then came the night of the diplomatic gala, aboard the orbital station Kethera Prime. Hundreds of dignitaries from a dozen species filled the glittering halls, and Tyeli was dressed in ceremonial silver that made her glow like a small star. Aiden stood in the shadows near the wall, in his plain dark uniform, and watched the crowd with careful eyes. Halfway through the evening, Tyeli slipped away from the main hall, through a service corridor that she thought no one was watching. Aiden followed. She moved quickly through the lower levels of the station until she reached a cargo area that was supposed to be restricted, and she stepped through an unlocked door into a room full of crates and the low hum of voices. Caught the door before it closed, and looked inside, and saw 4 aliens of a species he did not recognize, surrounded by open weapon crates. These were black market arms dealers, and Tyeli had walked right into their deal. The dealers saw her and reached for their guns, and Tyeli froze. Aiden stepped through the door before anyone could fire, and he put himself between Tyeli and the dealers with his hands open and visible, and he spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Gentlemen," he said, "the lady took a wrong turn. We have no interest in your business, and you have no interest in killing a Velhari royal and bringing the entire Dominion fleet down on this station. So let us walk out, and you can go back to your evening." The lead dealer stared at him for a long moment, and then looked at Tyeli, and then back at Aiden, and something in Aiden's eyes must have told him that this human was not bluffing, because he lowered his weapon and jerked his head toward the door. Tyeli out with one hand on her arm, and they walked in silence back to the upper levels. The jungle moon of Oron 7 was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. The trees grew tall enough to block out the sky, and their bark was dark red like dried blood, and their leaves glowed faintly green even at night, as if the forest itself was alive and breathing. Ancient stone ruins dotted the landscape, remnants of a civilization that had died long before any living species had learned to build starships. This was the sacred neutral ground chosen for the Peace Summit, and Aiden hated every inch of it. Too much cover for attackers, too many blind spots, too many ways in and out. The whole moon was a killing ground dressed up as holy land. He had submitted a 30-page security assessment to Lord Vethis 2 weeks before the summit, and he had recommended changes to the guard rotations, the communication protocols, and the emergency extraction plans. Vethis had read exactly none of it. "We have protected Velhari royalty for 1,000 years, human," Vethis had said with his usual cold smile. "We do not need advice from a species that still uses gunpowder." Aiden had not argued, because arguing with Vethis was like arguing with a stone wall, except the stone wall was more likely to change its mind. Instead, he had spent those 2 weeks doing everything he could on his own. He packed extra ammunition and medical supplies and analog communication gear that did not rely on power cells or signal networks. He studied the layout of the summit site until he could walk it blindfolded, and he identified 3 fallback positions in the ruins where a small group could hold out if everything went wrong. He did not tell anyone about these preparations, because no one would have listened. The summit began on a warm morning, with the air thick and heavy with moisture, and the sound of alien birds calling from the canopy above. 3 Velhari noble houses had sent delegations, along with representatives from 2 allied species and a small human diplomatic team from Earth. The main pavilion was a beautiful open structure built among the ruins, with columns of white stone and a roof of woven energy shields that shimmered like soap bubbles in the light. Princess Tyeli arrived with her guard detail, and Aiden walked 3 steps behind her, as always. She looked different here, more tense, more aware, and Aiden could see the way her eyes moved across the crowd, checking faces the way he had taught her without ever meaning to. She had been watching him, and she had learned. During the first day of talks, Aiden stood at his post and listened and watched, and the political discussions meant little to him, but the room itself told him everything he needed to know. He counted the guards and their positions, and he noted which ones were alert and which ones were bored, and he watched the service staff moving in and out, and he memorized their faces. The formal dinner. Tyeli found him on a balcony overlooking the jungle. The twin moons of Oran 7 hung low and heavy in the sky and cast silver light across the treetops. "You do not like this place," she said. "No," Aiden replied. "Why?" "Because it is built for beauty, not for safety, and those two things rarely go together." She leaned against the railing and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you know what it is like to be the spare princess, Captain?" "No, Your Highness." "It means that everything about you is temporary. Your value, your purpose, even your name. You exist only until you are needed for a trade or a treaty, and then you become someone else's problem. My mother has 3 daughters, and I am the one she would miss the least." Aiden looked at her and said, "I do not believe that." "You do not know my mother." "No, but I know something about being expendable. The galaxy looks at humans the same way your mother looks at you, short-lived and replaceable, but that does not make it true." Tyeli turned to him and studied his face with those deep amber eyes, and she said, "You are a strange human, Aiden Hale." "I have been told that before," he replied. She almost smiled, and it was the first time he had seen anything close to warmth on her face. The second day of the summit was longer and more tense, and Aiden could feel something wrong in the air, the way an old sailor can feel a storm before the clouds appear. He could not explain it, but every instinct he had was screaming. He pulled aside the 2 human Marines assigned to the diplomatic team, a sergeant named Cora Vasquez and a corporal named James Obi, and he told them to keep their analog gear on them at all times, and to be ready to move fast. "You think something is going to happen, Captain?" Vasquez asked. "I think if nothing happens, I will be happy to be wrong," Aiden said. The sun began to set on the second day. Sky turned the color of fire, and the delegates gathered in the main pavilion for the signing ceremony. Aiden stood behind Tyeli, and his hand rested on his sidearm, and he watched every face in the room, and then the lights went out. Not just the lights, but everything. Every Velhari energy shield, and every biotech weapon, and every communication device, and every piece of advanced technology within a mile radius died at the same instant. EMP weapons, military grade, detonated in a ring around the summit site. The darkness was total and absolute, and in that darkness the screaming began. Aiden did not scream, and he did not freeze, and he did not panic, because panic was a luxury he had never been able to afford. He grabbed Tyeli by the arm and pulled her to the floor, and covered her body with his own, as gunfire erupted from 3 directions at once. The Velhari Royal Guard was in chaos. Their weapons were dead, their armor was offline. Communications were gone. 300 years of technological superiority had been erased in a single second, and they did not know how to fight without it. Aiden knew how to fight without it, because he had never had it in the first place. He drew his sidearm, which was a simple ballistic weapon that did not need a power cell or a targeting computer, and he fired 3 shots into the darkness at the muzzle flashes he could see, and 2 of those shots found their targets. "Stay low and follow me," he said to Tyeli, and his voice was calm and steady, as if this were just another training exercise. He moved through the darkness with one hand on Tyeli and his weapon in the other, navigating by memory, because he had memorized this building down to the last stone. They reached a side corridor, and Aiden found Vasquez and Obi already there with their weapons drawn, their analog gear working perfectly in the dead zone. 3 Velhari guards stumbled out of the darkness, disoriented and terrified, and Aiden grabbed the first one and said, "You are with me now. Follow my lead or die. Those are your only options." The Velhari guard looked at this small human giving orders in the middle of a massacre, and something in Aiden's voice made him obey without question. Aiden led them out of the pavilion and into the jungle and toward the ruins where he had prepared his fallback positions. Behind them, the summit site burned, and the sound of weapons fire echoed through the trees, and the separatist kill squads of the uncrowned moved through the smoke, hunting for royal blood. The jungle was dark and alive with sound, and Aiden moved through it like a ghost, with Tyeli close behind him, and his small band of survivors following in a tight formation. He set traps as they moved, using wire and grenades from his pack, and twice they heard explosions behind them as pursuers hit his tripwires. He used the terrain the way a chess player uses the board, funneling enemies into kill zones, using the ruins as cover, making the separatists pay for every step they took. The Velhari guards watched him with wide eyes. This human moved through war the way their kind moved through art, with a terrible and beautiful precision that they had never seen before. Tyeli stayed close to him, and she did not cry, and she did not freeze. And when he handed her a knife and told her to hold it, she took it without hesitation. The night was long and dark and full of death, and Aiden held them together through all of it. But as dawn began to break through the canopy above, and the sound of extraction ships grew closer, a final kill squad found them. 12 heavily armed separatists closing in from the east, with more coming behind them. There was only one way out, and it led through a narrow stone corridor in the ruins. And there was no way to hold that corridor and protect Tyeli at the same time. Looked at the corridor, and then he looked at Tyeli, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood go cold. "No," she whispered. But he had already made his choice. Aiden turned to Sergeant Vasquez, and his voice was the calmest thing in that jungle full of fire and death. "Take the princess and go north through the secondary passage. Extraction is less than 10 minutes out. Do not stop for anything." Vasquez looked at him, and she understood immediately what he was doing, and for a moment something broke behind her eyes. But she was a Marine, and she knew what orders meant. "Yes, Captain," she said. Aiden turned to the 3 Velhari guards and said, "You go with them. Protect her with your lives. That is the only thing that matters now." The lead Velhari guard stared at him and said, "What will you do?" "I will hold this corridor." "Alone?" "Alone." The guard looked at the narrow stone passage that cut through the ancient ruins, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with high walls of dark red stone rising on either side. And then he looked at the jungle behind them, where the sound of approaching enemies grew louder with every second. "That is impossible," the guard said. "There are dozens of them." Aiden checked his ammunition and counted what he had left, and it was not much, but it was enough to make a difference, and he said, "Then I will make it expensive for them." Tyeli grabbed his arm, and her fingers dug into his sleeve, and her amber eyes were wide with something he had never seen in them before. "Do not do this," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "There has to be another way." Aiden looked at her, and for a moment the soldier fell away, and there was just a man looking at someone he cared about. And he said, "There is no other way, and even if there was, I would still choose this one, because keeping you alive is the only thing I have ever been sure about." "Aiden, please." He gently removed her hand from his arm, and he said, "Go now. Run fast. Do not look back." Vasquez pulled Tyeli away, and Corporal Obi took the other side, and the Velhari guards formed up around her, and they began to move north through the secondary passage. Tyeli looked back once, and she saw Aiden standing at the entrance of the corridor, with his weapon raised, and the first light of dawn catching the edges of his worn and battered armor. And he looked like something out of an old human legend, a single knight holding the gate against an army. Then the jungle swallowed her, and he was gone. Aiden turned to face the corridor, and he breathed in and breathed out, and he felt the familiar cold clarity settle over him like a second skin. He had been afraid many times in his life, but he had learned long ago that fear and courage were not opposites. They were partners. Fear told you what was at stake, and courage told you what to do about it. He positioned himself at the narrowest point of the corridor, where the wall squeezed close enough that only one or two attackers could come at him at a time. His advantage, the only one he had, and he intended to use every inch of it. The first separatists came through the corridor at a run, expecting to find fleeing prey, and instead they found Aiden Hale. He fired twice, and the first two fell, and the ones behind them stumbled over the bodies, and Aiden fired again and again, with a precision that was almost mechanical. The corridor became a killing ground. The separatists pulled back and regrouped, and then they came again in a more organized push, with shields and covering fire. And Aiden took a round in his left shoulder that spun him against the wall. But he kept his feet and kept firing. His armor caught some of the shots, and the ones that did not catch, he simply endured, because there was no other option. They came a third time, and this time they brought grenades, and the explosion threw Aiden backward and filled the corridor with dust and smoke and ringing silence. He got up, side of his face, and his left arm was barely working, and his ears were screaming. But he got up, and he checked his weapon, and he got back into position. The separatists could not believe it. They had fought Velhari guards and allied soldiers and mercenaries from a dozen worlds, and none of them had ever faced anything like this. This human was broken and bleeding, and outgunned and outnumbered, and he simply would not fall. They came again, and Aiden dropped 4 more of them before his primary weapon ran empty, and he switched to his backup and kept firing. His world narrowed to the corridor and the shapes that moved within it, and the simple, terrible math of ammunition versus enemies. When his backup weapon ran dry, he drew his combat knife, and the separatists who came through the corridor next found themselves facing a wounded human with a blade, and eyes that held no fear at all. He killed 3 more with the knife before it broke against an armored chest plate, and then he fought with his fists and his elbows and his teeth, and every dirty trick that human beings had learned in 10,000 years of killing each other. A shot hit him in the leg, and he went to one knee, but he grabbed the shooter and broke his neck, and took his weapon and fired it until it was empty too. He could not count the bodies anymore. He could not count the wounds on his own body either. 11 times he had been shot, and each time some stubborn, impossible part of him had refused to stop. The corridor floor was slick with blood, both his and theirs, and the walls were scarred with blast marks and bullet holes, and the dawn light that filtered down from above turned everything the color of copper. The last group of separatists entered the corridor and found Aiden on his knees with nothing left in his hands and blood pooling beneath him. And still he looked up at them with those steady human eyes. One of them raised his weapon and said, "Why will you not die?" Aiden smiled, and it was a terrible and beautiful thing. And he whispered, "Because she is not safe yet." The shot that finally brought him down echoed through the ruins, and then the corridor was silent. When the extraction team arrived 40 minutes later, they found the survivors safe at the northern extraction point. Tyeli was alive and unharmed, and the moment the rescue ship landed, she collapsed and began to scream his name. Vasquez reported what had happened in a voice that was flat and hollow, and the extraction commander sent a team back to the corridor. What they found there would become legend. 23 separatist soldiers lay dead in that narrow stone passage, and at the very center of them with his back against the wall, and his broken knife still clutched in one hand, was Captain Aidan Hale. He had been shot 11 times, twice in the chest, and 3 times in the abdomen, and once in the neck, and the rest across his arms and legs, and the medic who examined him said that by all medical logic he should have died after the 4th shot. He had killed 23 and held the corridor for over 30 minutes alone. The news traveled fast, first through the extraction fleet, and then through the Valhari military, and then through the royal court itself. The footage from the helmet cameras of the surviving Valhari guards was reviewed and analyzed and reviewed again, because no one could believe what they were seeing. A single human, a mayfly, with primitive weapons and no energy shields and no bioenhancements, had done what an entire company of Valhari royal guards had failed to do. He had held the line. Queen Savara of the Valhari received the report in her private chambers aboard the Aureate Spire, and she watched the footage from beginning to end without speaking. She saw the corridor and the bodies, and the man who had stood between death and her daughter. Moment when he smiled at his killers and told them why he would not stop. The queen had ruled for 300 years, and she had seen empires rise and fall, and she had buried allies and enemies alike, and she was not a woman who was easily moved. But she watched that footage 3 times, and on the 3rd viewing, her hand trembled. She summoned Lord Vethis, and when he arrived, she said, "Explain to me how one human did what your entire guard could not." Vethis had no answer. The queen then issued a decree that shook the foundations of the Dominion. Captain Aidan Hale's body would not be returned to Earth. He would be taken to the Vault of Eternity, the most sacred place in the Valhari Dominion, where only royalty and the greatest heroes in their history had ever been laid. He would be given the chance at resurrection. No alien had ever been granted this honor in the entire history of the Valhari people. When the Earth diplomatic delegation protested and demanded the return of their soldier, the queen looked at them with eyes as old as stars and said, "He died as one of ours, and he will rise as one of ours. This is not negotiable." And in a small room on the medical ship, Tieli sat alone, holding the broken knife they had taken from Aidan's hand. And she did not speak, and she did not eat, and she did not sleep. She just held the knife and waited for something that felt impossible. The Vault of Eternity lay deep beneath the Aureate Spire, in chambers that had not been opened for living visitors in over 60 years. The walls were made of a stone that predated the Valhari civilization itself, dark and smooth and warm to the touch, as if something ancient still pulsed within it. And the air was thick with the hum of machines so advanced that even the Valhari techno-priests who operated them did not fully understand how they worked. This was where gods were made, or at least, that is what the Valhari believed. Aidan Hale's body lay on a platform of pale crystal in the center of the main resurrection chamber, and the machines around him glowed with a soft golden light that moved like liquid across his skin. He looked peaceful in a way that he never had in life, the tension gone from his jaw, the watchfulness gone from his closed eyes, the scars still visible across his arms and chest like a map of every fight he had ever survived. One he did not. The techno-priests worked in silence and moved around the platform like ghosts in their long silver robes, adjusting instruments and monitoring readings that scrolled across floating displays in a language older than most civilizations. High Priest Elara, the chief resurrection specialist, stood at the head of the platform and studied the human body before her with a mixture of fascination and dread. She had resurrected 11 Valhari in her career, 7 successfully, 4 not, and those 4 failures still haunted her dreams. But she had never attempted this on an alien species, and certainly not on a human. Human biology was so different from Valhari biology that it might as well have been written in a foreign language. Their nervous system was crude but resilient. Their cellular structure was simple but adaptive, and their brain was a chaotic storm of electrical impulses that seemed to run on sheer stubbornness rather than any logical pattern. "The Queen commands this," Alara said to her assistant. "But the Queen cannot command biology. This may not work." "Then we will die trying," her assistant replied, because that was the reality of a royal command in the Velhari Dominion. Far above them, in the political halls of the Oriat Spire, a different kind of battle was raging. Earth's ambassador, a sharp-eyed woman named Director Helena Cross, had lodged a formal protest with the Velhari Foreign Ministry, demanding the immediate return of Captain Hale's remains. "He is a citizen of Earth and a soldier of our military," Cross said to the assembled Velhari diplomats. "You have no right to keep him." The Velhari Foreign Minister responded with the calm certainty of a species that had been running an empire for millennia, and said, "The Queen has spoken. Captain Hale died in defense of the royal bloodline. By our oldest laws, he is claimed by the throne. Your laws do not apply to our people. They do when your people bleed for our crown." The diplomatic standoff grew worse by the day, and there were whispers in the galactic press that this could be the thing that shattered the fragile alliance between Earth and the Velhari Dominion. The very treaty that Aiden had died to protect was now in danger because of the argument over his body. Tyeli watched all of this from the edges of the court, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical thing. She went to her mother's private audience chamber and found the Queen standing at the window, looking out at the stars. "Mother," Tyeli said, "Earth will not stop pushing. They want him back." "I know what Earth wants," Queen Savara replied without turning. "If this breaks the alliance, then everything Aiden did was for nothing. Everything he sacrificed will be meaningless." The Queen turned then and looked at her youngest daughter, and for a moment the mask of the polished color palette says, "Sovereign" slipped, and Tyeli saw something raw and complicated beneath it. "Do you think I do this out of sentiment?" the Queen said. "Do you think I keep his body because your heart is broken?" "I do not know why you do it," Tyeli said. The Queen walked to her daughter and stood close enough that Tyeli could see the faint lines of age that even Velhari longevity could not fully erase. "I watched the footage from that corridor," the Queen said. "I watched a single human with no enhancements and no technology and no biological advantages fight 40 soldiers alone. I watched him get shot 11 times and keep fighting. I watched him smile at his killers." She paused and her voice dropped lower. "For 300 years, every species in this galaxy has looked at humanity and seen vermin, short-lived and primitive and replaceable. I looked at that corridor and I saw something that terrifies me. Because if one human can do that, then what happens when billions of them stop being afraid of us?" Tyeli stared at her mother. "I am not keeping him out of gratitude," the Queen continued. "I am keeping him because the smartest thing I can do for the Dominion is bind humanity to us with chains of honor and debt before anyone else realizes what they truly are. If we resurrect him, if we give him the highest honor our civilization can offer, then humanity owes us something that cannot be repaid with politics. They owe us with their hearts." "That is cold," Tyeli whispered. "That is survival," the Queen replied. "But it does not mean I do not also grieve for the man who saved my daughter." Inside the vault, the resurrection process had entered its most critical phase. Alara and her team had spent weeks rebuilding Aiden's body, cell by cell, repairing the catastrophic damage from 11 gunshot wounds and multiple blast injuries, reconstructing organs that had been shredded and bones that had been shattered. Reconstruction was almost complete, but the hardest part still remained. The consciousness. Velhari resurrection technology could rebuild a body, but the mind was a different matter entirely. It had to be coaxed back from wherever it had gone, drawn out of the void and anchored to the repaired flesh. For Velhari minds, this was difficult but understood. Their neural patterns followed predictable paths, and the techno-priests knew how to call them home. Aiden's mind was something else entirely. When Alara connected the neural interface and tried to map his consciousness, she found chaos. Human thought patterns were not organized the way Velhari patterns were. They were a wild tangle of memory and emotion and instinct, all firing at once, like a storm that had somehow learned to think. And there was something else, something she had never encountered before. His consciousness was not drifting the way a dead mind should drift. It was not fading or dissolving, or slipping away into the void. It was fighting. Even in death, Aiden Hale was fighting. His neural pattern surged against the resurrection interface like a trapped animal throwing itself against the walls of a cage, not rejecting the process exactly, but refusing to submit to it, insisting on coming back on his own terms or not at all. His mind will not yield, Alara reported to the Queen. It pushes back against every protocol we use. I have never seen anything like this. Can you bring him back? The Queen asked. I do not know. His brain seems to be rebuilding its own pathways independent of our guidance. It is as if his consciousness is resurrecting itself and merely using our technology as fuel. Is that possible? It should not be. Tyeli began to sit vigil in the vault, something that was normally forbidden for anyone below the rank of High Priest, but the Queen made an exception that she did not explain. Tyeli sat beside the crystal platform and watched the golden light move across Aiden's still face, and she talked to him. She told him about the political storm raging above them, and about the Earth ambassador who was threatening sanctions, and about Lord Vethis, who had been quietly stripped of his command after the Summit massacre. She told him about the corridor, and how the footage had spread across the galaxy, and how humans everywhere were calling him a hero, and how the Velhari were calling him something they had no word for, because they had never needed one before. She told him that the word they were creating for him meant something like, the one who would not stop. And she told him things she had never told anyone, about the loneliness of being the spare princess, about the years of being invisible, about how he was the first person who had ever made her feel like she was worth protecting, not because of her title, but because of who she was. Hummed, and the golden light pulsed, and Aiden's face remained still and peaceful. And then one night, deep in the quiet hours when even the techno-priests had stepped away to rest, Tyeli was sitting beside him with her hand near his. She was not touching him because the resurrection field did not allow direct contact, but her fingers were close enough to feel the warmth. And she heard it, a single heartbeat, faint and unsteady, like the first beat of a drum at the start of a song. Then another, and another. The monitors exploded with activity, and alarms rang through the vault, and the techno-priests came running, but Tyeli did not move. She watched Aiden's chest rise with a breath, and then his fingers twitched, and then slowly, impossibly, his eyes opened. They were not the same color as before. The deep brown she remembered was now threaded with veins of faint gold, a luminescence that marked him as a child of the vault. Room with the sharp awareness of a man who had woken up in an unfamiliar place and was already looking for threats. His gaze found Tyeli, and he looked at her for a long moment, and his cracked, dry lips moved, and in a voice like gravel he whispered, "Did they get you out?" Tyeli broke. She bent over him, and she wept in a way that the youngest daughter of the most powerful queen in the galaxy was never supposed to weep, and the tears fell on the crystal platform and caught the golden light. And Aiden, still more dead than alive, still broken in ways that had not yet been repaired, raised one trembling hand and let it rest beside hers. "I will take that as a yes," he whispered. And somewhere deep in the ancient machines of the vault, something hummed with a new note, as if the technology itself was surprised by what it had just accomplished. The news of Aiden Hale's resurrection spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry grass. Every news channel and every diplomatic frequency and every military intelligence network carried the same impossible story. A human had been granted the Velhari's most sacred right. A human had been brought back from death in the vault of eternity. A human had been deemed worthy of an honor that most Velhari would never receive in their centuries-long lives. On Earth, people gathered in the streets and watched the broadcasts with tears in their eyes, because for the first time since humanity had stumbled onto the galactic stage, one of their own had not been treated as lesser. On the Velhari throne world, the reaction was more complicated. The noble houses were divided. Some saw the resurrection as a brilliant political move that bound humanity closer to the Dominion, and others saw it as a desecration of their most sacred traditions, a pollution of the vault by alien blood. Lord Vethis, already humiliated by his removal from command, became the voice of the opposition, and he gathered allies among the old guard families who believed that the Queen had gone too far. But the common Velhari, the soldiers and workers and ordinary citizens, had watched the corridor footage, and they had seen what Aiden Hale had done, and many of them whispered that if the vault was meant for heroes, then no one had ever deserved it more. Aiden knew none of this during the first weeks of his recovery. He lay in the medical wing of the Aureate Spire, and he fought a different battle, the battle of learning to live inside a body that was his, and yet not entirely his anymore. The vault had rebuilt him, but it had also changed him. His senses were sharper now. He could hear conversations 3 rooms away, and he could see in near total darkness, and his reflexes were faster than any unaugmented human had a right to possess. Rate that astonished the Velhari doctors, and when they ran tests on his cellular structure, they found something remarkable. The vault's resurrection process had woven Velhari regenerative proteins into his human DNA, creating something that was neither fully human nor Velhari, but something new. His eyes were the most visible change. The deep brown was now laced with gold that glowed faintly in low light, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw a stranger looking back at him. "What am I?" he asked the chief medical officer one morning. "We do not have a word for what you are," the doctor replied. "You are the first." Tyeli visited him every day, and she was the only person in his world who did not look at him as if he were a miracle or a monster. She looked at him the same way she had looked at him on that balcony on Oron 7, like he was simply a man, complicated and real and worth knowing. "The court is in chaos because of you," she told him one afternoon. He sat on the edge of his bed, testing the strength of his rebuilt left hand. "That seems to be my specialty," he said. "Earth wants you back. The Queen wants to give you a title. The noble houses want you exiled. And the galaxy wants to know if you are still human." "What do you want?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want you to be free to choose for yourself. It is the one thing nobody in my world has ever been offered, and I think you deserve it more than anyone." Aiden looked at her, and something passed between them that did not need words. 3 days later, he was summoned to the Queen's private audience chamber. Queen Savara stood in the center of the room, dressed in the deep crimson of formal court attire, and her presence filled the space the way a sun fills a solar system. Everything orbited around her, whether it wanted to or not. "Captain Hale," she said, "you died in my service, and you returned by my command. Do you understand what that means?" "It means I owe you a great deal, Your Majesty," Aiden said. "It means the galaxy is watching, and what happens next will shape the relationship between our peoples for generations. I am offering you the title of Sentinel Eternal, a rank that has not existed in over 1,000 years, the protector of the royal bloodline who answers only to the throne itself. You would be the highest-ranking non-Velhari in the history of the Dominion." Aiden stood very still and let the weight of that offer settle over him. And if I refuse, he asked, then you return to Earth as a hero and a curiosity, and the alliance between our peoples remains fragile and uncertain. And if I accept on my own terms, the Queen raised one elegant eyebrow and said, that depends entirely on your terms. Before the ceremony, there was one more conversation that Aiden needed to have. Director Cross, from the Earth delegation, came to see him, quarters, and she brought with her a secure communication from Earth's military command. They want you to come home, Captain, Cross said. They want to study what the Vault did to you, and they want you leading training programs, and they want you as the face of Earth's military on the galactic stage. With respect, Director, I did not die for a recruitment poster, Aiden said. Then what did you die for? Cross asked. I died for a girl who was standing behind me in a stone corridor. Everything else is politics, Aiden said. Cross studied him for a long moment, and then she said, if you stay here, you become theirs. You know that. No, Aiden said. I become a bridge, and bridges belong to both sides. The ceremony was held in the Grand Throne Hall of the Oriat Spire, and it was the largest gathering the throne world had seen in a century. Representatives from 12 species filled the enormous chamber with its soaring crystal walls and its ceiling that opened to the stars. Above, and the air hummed with the energy of a moment that everyone present knew was historic. Aiden walked down the central aisle in a uniform that blended human military design with Velhari ceremonial elements, dark fabric with silver trim, and the golden crest of the vault over his heart. He walked alone, because that was how he had always done things. Queen Savara stood on the raised platform before the throne, and her crown caught the starlight and scattered it across the room like diamonds. The hall fell silent as Aiden stopped before her, and the silence was so deep that he could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong, in his rebuilt chest. Captain Aiden Hale of Earth, the Queen said, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast room. You gave your life in defense of the royal blood. You held a corridor alone against an army. You died with 11 wounds and the enemy at your feet, and when we called you back from death, you fought your way to life with the same stubborn fire that made you a legend. She paused and looked at him, and Aiden met her gaze without flinching, because he had faced worse things than the eyes of a queen. I offer you the title of Sentinel Eternal, Protector of the Throne, Guardian of the Bloodline. Will you accept? Aiden took a breath and said, I accept the title, Your Majesty, but I have conditions. A murmur ran through the hall, because no one had ever placed conditions on a royal appointment before. I will serve as Sentinel Eternal, Aiden continued, but I will also serve as a bridge between Earth and the Dominion. I will not be a weapon pointed at your enemies, and I will not be a trophy displayed for your allies. I will be what I have always been. And what is that? The Queen asked. A shield, he said, for anyone who needs one. The Queen held his gaze for a long moment, and then something shifted in her ancient eyes, and it might have been respect. She said. And then Aiden turned to face the assembled representatives of a dozen species, and he spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across that enormous hall. I am not the best humanity has to offer. I am just the one who was standing in the right place. But I want every species in this room to understand something about my people. Every human you have ever dismissed, every mayfly you have ever overlooked, would have done what I did, not because we are stronger or smarter or more advanced, but because when someone we care about is in danger, we do not calculate the odds, we do not measure the cost, we just act. He paused, and his golden-threaded eyes swept across the silent room. That is not a boast, that is a warning and an invitation. You can fear us, or you can stand beside us, but either way, you should know what we are. We are the species that runs toward the fire. We are the species that holds the line, and we are the species that will die for someone we met 3 weeks ago, if that someone matters. The silence that followed was absolute. And then Queen Savara did something that no living being in that hall had ever witnessed in 300 years of her reign. She rose from the steps of the throne, and she inclined her head to Aiden Hale, a human, a mayfly, a man who had died and come back, and still stood with the same quiet strength that had carried him through that stone corridor on Oran 7. The hall erupted. Later that night, when the ceremony was over, and the diplomats had returned to their ships, and the politicians had retreated to scheme and plan, Aiden walked the corridors of the palace alone. Old habits died hard, even after dying themselves. He checked sightlines and exits and blind spots. He noted guard positions and patrol timings. He listened to the silence the way a hunter listens to the forest. Footsteps behind him, light and familiar. Tayeli fell into step beside him, and they walked together through the crystalline halls without speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said. They reached a wide observation gallery and stopped and looked out through the transparent walls at the infinite darkness of space. Somewhere out there, among the billions of stars, was a small yellow sun that warmed a small blue planet, where a boy named Aiden Hale had once looked up at the sky and wondered if anything was out there. That boy had grown into a soldier who had crossed the stars and given his life for an alien princess, and been brought back from death by a queen who refused to let him go. He was not the same man he had been before, and he was not sure what he was becoming, but standing here in the quiet, with Tylee beside him, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, he would face it the way humans always had. Head up, eyes open, and refusing to stop. Through the crystalline walls of the aureate spire, Earth's pale star was barely visible among the billions of lights that filled the sky. But it burned steady, and that was enough.